Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Chris Lefty, who is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Western Australia. He specializes in philosophy of mind, philosophy of cognitive science, and philosophy of neuroscience. Among other things, he's interested in the causal mechanisms and epistemic status of transformative spiritual practices, the possibility of a naturalistic spirituality, and the nature of the self and self-awareness. His monograph, which I own and is a great monograph, Philosophy of Psychedelics, was published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. The book has received 2 awards already, both from the University of Adelaide, and a Spanish translation was published in 2022. So please help me welcome Dr. Chris Lefty.
All right, thanks so much, Brian. Thanks, Meta, for organizing and inviting me. Like Olivia, I'm really glad to be up at the end of the day because so many of the talks previously have covered so many parts of my talk that there is actually a chance, a small one admittedly, but there's a chance that I might finish on time just by dint of being able to say things like, you already know all about this. So we'll see how that pans out. The talk, like all my talks, is in 3 parts. So in the first part, I'm going to talk about the use of psychedelics, classic psychedelics in palliative care. In the second part, I'm going to talk about the neuroexistentialist project that you already know all about from Meta's talk and others. And then I'm going to look at an issue that arises because, first of all, it seems pretty obvious that there might be some way of applying psychedelics or psychedelic research to the neuroexistentialist project. But then there's a particular problem that arises. And in brief, this is the concern that psychedelics might improve people's psychological and existential situation by inducing comforting delusions, in Michael Pollan's phrase. And this doesn't seem like, at least to me, the sort of thing we should want. So that's a potential obstacle to applying psychedelics to this project. And I think to resolve that obstacle, or to see if it can be resolved, we need to know more about how psychedelics work, right? About how they actually cause these lasting psychological benefits that they seem capable of causing. And we don't really know that yet. So in part 3, which is by far the longest part of the talk, I'm going to start looking at mechanistic questions. How do psychedelics actually cause these lasting psychological benefits that they seem capable of causing? And there are a few different theories going around, and the conclusion of the talk, of course, is going to be that my theory is the best one, and also that if my theory is true, then maybe this problem actually can be solved. So we'll see how convincing this all is. First up, palliative psychedelics. So as you all know by now, classic psychedelics, as they're called, serotonergic hallucinogens, are a particular class of psychoactive serotonin 2A receptor agonists. The most famous examples are LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT. And these substances, many of them occur naturally in various species of plants and animals. They have long histories of ceremonial, medicinal, religious use in indigenous cultures, at least centuries, but the evidence is now pointing towards millennia. And they can induce dose-dependently, as we've just heard, profound and also extremely variable changes to conscious experience. So although, as Olivia says, you know, the effects are not random, still, as she also pointed out, they do vary a lot, right? So the effects of psychedelics depend heavily on what's called set and setting, the psychological state of the person taking the drug and the environment, physical, social, aesthetic, etc., in which they take it. And so you see changes to all these modalities of conscious experience, perception, emotion, cognition, and thinking, the experiences of space, time, body, and self. And especially at high doses, the changes to the sense of self can lead to or can constitute part of these experiences that are described as ego dissolution, or in some cases, they're referred to using this psychometric construct of a mystical type experience. So this is going to come up again and again, and it's worth emphasizing that this is a particular operational psychometric construct. There are validated questionnaires that have been developed, and they're based on work in the philosophy and psychology of religion, and this idea that you get in people like William James and Walter Stace, that there is a common type of experience found across times, places, and religious traditions that is defined by a sort of core set of phenomenological features. First and foremost, a sense of unity, the dissolution of the sense of being an individual self, and a feeling of profound oneness, unity, or interconnectedness. But other features are the so-called noetic quality, the feeling that direct, unmediated knowledge of ultimate reality is being gained, the transcendence of time and space, the feeling that the experience is non-spatial, atemporal, a touch of eternity, profound, deeply felt positive mood, and things like this. So then you have these questionnaires that are designed to try and operationalize this idea of a mystical experience, and then people are deemed to have had a mystical type experience, a complete mystical type experience, if they score above a certain cutoff, a certain threshold on these questionnaires. So in fact, with one of these scales, the MEQ, the mystical experience questionnaire, you're deemed to have had a complete mystical type experience if you score 60% or more on all 7 of the subscales. And so I just want to emphasize from the outset that there's this possibility that you might score that much on that questionnaire and yet not necessarily have had the sort of thing that William James or Walter Stace would recognize as a mystical experience in the full-blooded sense. There is this possible dissociation between the sort of pre-theoretic concept of a mystical experience proper, and then this operational psychometric construct of a complete mystical type experience. And it's in the room between those two that I try and do a lot of my argumentative work about what's going on here. So to date, there have been 3 distinct waves of scientific interest in classic psychedelics. From now on, when I say psychedelics, I just mean these classic serotonergic ones. So I'm not talking about some of these other drugs that sometimes get called psychedelic in a broader sense. I'm not talking about ketamine, cannabis, MDMA, salvia divinorum, just the serotonin 2A agonists. So in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, there was a fair bit of scientific interest in mescaline, which is found in various cacti in the Americas. Then there was a big wave of interest in the 1950s and 60s after the discovery in the 1940s of LSD, a semi-synthetic. And now for actually about 3 decades, since the early 90s, there's been what's now being called the psychedelic renaissance, this sort of resurgence of research into the effects of psychedelics on human subjects. And it's really picked up steam in the last sort of 10 years or so, but it has been going slowly since, in fact, actually the late 80s, the first studies began in a couple of different places. So what have we learned so far? Well, the most important thing I think to emphasize is that you can give people psychedelics safely, right? Because there's a very common conception that you can't, they're just too risky. Now, they're known to be physiologically very safe, right? So fatal overdoses are virtually unknown. Physiological dependence, like you see with some other drugs, is essentially unknown. The risks, which are real, are mainly psychological, but it's now being shown that at least when due care is taken in controlled clinical conditions, even the psychological safety profile is very, very good. So I'm not going to make any claims about what happens outside of controlled clinical conditions, but when you screen your subjects carefully and prepare them properly and supervise the experience, even moderate to quite high doses can be given with virtually no sort of lasting adverse effects reported. And I just want to emphasize too that most of the research to date has focused on high doses, right? So fully psychedelic doses that give you a full-blown trip. So there's a lot of hype out there in the popular press about microdosing, this practice wherein people take tiny kind of so-called sub-perceptual doses every 2 or 3 days, and it's supposed to have various therapeutic and enhancement benefits. There's very little good research on microdosing so far, right? So people sometimes assume that all this clinical work, because it's being done safely, they must be giving really low doses. Well, it's not the case, right? All this research that is generating a lot of hype in psychiatry and neuroscience and demonstrating this apparent therapeutic potential, they're giving full on, you know, dissolve your ego, make you see God and unicorns and rainbows kind of doses. So basically, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, as it's called, psychedelic therapy for short, involves taking people with some kind of psychiatric condition, usually mood or addictive disorders, right? Depression, anxiety, various forms of addiction, and giving them typically some kind of psychotherapy. The exact form varies, and anywhere from 1 to 3 supervised full doses. And of course, in some studies, there's an attempt at doing double-blind, placebo-controlled sort of methodology. I say an attempt because effective double blinding is very difficult with full doses of psychedelics, right? Typically, the double-blind is broken, but still you have this common pattern wherein people with a psychiatric diagnosis, not of psychotic conditions, but as I say, mood and addictive disorders, are given psychotherapy plus 1 to 3 sessions that's either full dose psychedelic or placebo, and generally speaking in the psychedelic group, but not the placebo group, after the drug session, but not after the commencement of therapy, you see these dramatic reductions in symptoms that last anywhere from a week up to, in some cases, 4 years, right? And then there are also studies in healthy subjects, people without a psychiatric diagnosis, that follow a similar protocol absent any formal psychotherapy, and you see analogous effects, right? So you see increases in various measures of well-being, measures of personality, measures of mindfulness and things like this. And again, they tend to increase quite substantially following a single psychedelic experience and stay elevated for anywhere from a few days to a few months, and in some cases, a year or more. And importantly, when you look at what predicts these benefits, right, these lasting psychological benefits from a psychedelic experience, whether they be reductions in psychiatric symptoms, changes in personality, increases in well-being, you find again and again that the strongest predictors are not to do with the dose of the drug, right, or any other kind of low-level biological, pharmacological variable. Rather, the most consistent predictors are aspects of the experience itself. So people are given various questionnaires about what their experience was like. So there's that mystical experience questionnaire I talked about, other instruments like that. And then there are other questionnaires that have been developed to measure things like, did you have an emotional breakthrough, you know, some feeling of catharsis and coming to terms with something emotional? Or did you have psychological insights into your own mind and personality and your life and motivations? And again, we find that these kinds of factors, these sorts of aspects of the psychedelic experience itself, are the most reliable predictors of who is going to get the lasting benefits and who is going to get fewer or no lasting benefits. Now, the best studied therapeutic indication so far, at least in the published scientific literature for psychedelic therapy, is the use in palliative care, basically the alleviation of depression, anxiety, and existential distress accompanying a diagnosis of terminal illness. So what happens in these studies is they take people with a diagnosis of a terminal illness, usually terminal cancer. They employ the sort of protocol that I described before, so some kind of psychotherapy punctuated by 1 or 2 or 3 full-dose psychedelic sessions compared against placebo. And you see after the psychedelic sessions, but not in the placebo group, these dramatic reductions in depression, anxiety, existential distress, fear of death and things like this. And at least in some studies, follow-ups at 4 years with the patients who were still alive 4 years later found that the benefits were largely maintained, right? Not fully, but still much better than baseline and still kind of complete remission, still no longer qualifying for these diagnoses in some cases. So to my mind, and so we've got these two sort of, they're not huge or anything, but these two decently sized double-blind randomized controlled trials both came out in 2016, one from Johns Hopkins, one from NYU, and they have a combined total of 80 subjects, and only one of them did the really long-term follow-up as far as I know, but they both show the same basic pattern, is that all these indices of psychological distress decrease dramatically after the first psychedelic session, but not after the placebo session, and they stay decreased for at least many months. And so to my mind, to my sort of philosophical eye, and given my particular philosophical interest, which overlaps significantly with the themes of this conference, when you look at these findings, right, the capacity, the apparent capacity of psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, to durably decrease fear of death and existential distress in the terminally ill, and then you put that side by side with the apparent transformative potential of psilocybin in healthy normals, right? Its apparent capacity to cause lasting psychological benefits in people without a psychiatric diagnosis, a particular thought occurs, which is, could we use these drugs in this same sort of way to alleviate existential angst and psychospiritual distress in non-clinical populations, right? The worried well. So people without a psychiatric diagnosis who have existential concerns about meaning in life and this kind of thing. So this brings us to the second part, which, as I said, you know all about by now, the neuroexistentialist project. So as you heard this morning from Meta, Owen Flanagan and Greg Caruso have claimed that there is a new wave of existential anxiety that's being caused chiefly by advances in the mind and brain sciences. And the story, which I want to stress is actually an empirical claim, and like a lot of these things could be tested, right? But I've just tended to accept it because it jives with my experience. But Flanagan and Caruso say, look, with every passing month and year, we make greater and greater strides in mapping the material, the neural and cognitive bases of these cherished human traits and capacities like self-awareness, decision-making, emotion, reasoning, and so on. And as we do this, this process of sort of studying the human mind scientifically makes plainer and plainer certain uncomfortable realities. For instance, we are, it seems, smart but merely material, evolved mortal animals who have no immortal soul, no objective purpose or reason for existing, no contra-causal free will, right? So in other words, no ability to make decisions irrespective of their causal antecedents and so on. So you get, according to Flanagan and Caruso, emerging from advances in the mind and brain sciences, a disenchanted image of humankind that clashes with our sort of cherished humanistic self-conception, thereby giving rise to this distinctive new wave of existential anxiety. And so Flanagan and Caruso say this situation we're in is the neuroexistentialist predicament, because we have an existentialist predicament or problem arising from advances of a neuro sort. But then they also propose, very interestingly, this neuroexistentialist project, which is that we turn to the source of the problem to look for solutions, right? So we turn to the mind and brain sciences themselves that supposedly are giving us this ever more detailed and vivid picture of how human minds as physical mechanisms, as material systems work, and see if they can tell us anything about how to live with this new disenchanted image, right? How to find peace and how to find some kind of sense of flourishing, meaning and purpose and so on in a world in which we increasingly conceive ourselves as merely mortal, contingent material beings along these disenchanted lines. So can understanding the mind and brain more deeply help us understand how to flourish in light of our increasingly vivid awareness of our disenchanted situation? And so I think in light of the sorts of findings I've been highlighting, the potential relevance of psychedelic research is obvious here, right? So we have a new wave of research into a neurotechnological intervention that, at least based on the findings so far, seems able durably to reduce existential distress and to restore a sense of meaning, purpose, and so on to the lives of people suffering from existential distress and fear of death and concerns about meaning. And there are at least two options here, right, for how we could apply psychedelic research to the neuroexistentialist project. The direct one is we look at using psychedelics themselves as an intervention, right? Is it viable to give psilocybin under controlled conditions to the worried well, to kind of non-clinical populations suffering from existential angst or existential distress? And the other option, which is perhaps less controversial to some minds, is we try and learn from studying psychedelics, right? Try and understand how psychedelics bring about these effects in clinical populations and try and see if we can reverse engineer other approaches to bringing about the same neural, cognitive, and phenomenological effects. But as I said, there is a concern that arises here, and it's what I call the comforting delusion objection to psychedelic therapy in my book that Brian mentioned. We can also view it as the comforting delusion objection to the neuroexistentialist application of psychedelics. And so the phrase comes from Michael Pollan, not in his kind of best-selling book, but in an article a few years earlier in the New Yorker, in which he asked, is psychedelic therapy simply foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying? And he's focusing particularly on the use of psychedelics of psilocybin in palliative care in terminal patients. And just to forestall kind of any misunderstandings, I should say, I don't think he's using the term delusion in a clinical sense. I think the worry rather is that psychedelic therapy works, alleviates kind of existential distress and psychiatric symptoms by instilling beliefs that are comforting but false or implausible. And so this is going to worry you if you subscribe to a broadly naturalist, materialist, or physicalist worldview, as I do, as Pollan does, as Flanagan and Caruso do. And so you look at what seems to be going on in these clinical trials of psilocybin in palliative care. You're taking people who have existential anxiety, existential distress, fear of death. You're giving them these high doses of hallucinogenic drugs, right, as the common term has it. And then you're looking at the kinds of experiences they have. And lo and behold, the ones who have mystical type experiences of unity and, you know, seeming to gain knowledge of ultimate reality are losing their fear of death, losing their existential anxiety and existential distress, and making peace with their own mortality. And so the obvious thing to think from a naturalist standpoint is, well, people are having sort of comforting false beliefs induced, right? They're having these overwhelmingly powerful, seemingly veridical experiences of encountering a sort of metaphysical ground of being, a cosmic consciousness or some kind of ultimate reality, exactly the kind of thing that, according to philosophical naturalists and materialists, doesn't exist, right? And this belief, this kind of unshakable, profound, experientially backed conviction that there is more to reality than a physicalist worldview would suggest, seems like the sort of thing that would obviously alleviate existential anxiety and fear of death. So if you think that the arguments for naturalism or physicalism are good, then you're liable to be concerned that psychedelics and this kind of application of psychedelics isn't a kind of viable solution to the neuroexistentialist predicament if you care about truth, if you care about knowledge, if you think that intellectual honesty is important. You might think that, you know, the neuroexistentialist brief is let's find ways of making peace with naturalism or making peace with physicalism. And you might think, well, the palliative use or the kind of neuroexistentialist use of psilocybin is not a way of making peace with naturalism and with our kind of neuroexistentialist predicament. It's a means of becoming persuaded of the falsity of naturalism. It's a means of gaining a kind of comforting, experientially grounded conviction that actually physicalism is false and there's more to reality. So this brings us to the mechanistic questions.
About 9 minutes, Chris.
Right, and about halfway through, good. So I'm glad I cut this part of the talk down. All right, let's get moving. I'm going to try and stop repeating myself. I need to remember you've already, well, actually the rest of it you haven't heard that much of already. So I picked the wrong phrase to kind of label my points. Anyway, I'm wasting more time. So, the comforting delusion objection to this kind of use of psychedelics involves both mechanistic and epistemic or epistemological claims. It claims that psychedelics bring about these lasting psychological benefits by inducing false or implausible beliefs. So to evaluate this objection and whether it really is an insuperable obstacle, we need to know exactly how psychedelics do produce these lasting benefits. And there are a few general theories of psychedelic therapy kicking around. Few, if any of them, focus explicitly on these sort of existential and palliative applications. And I think that makes these kinds of applications a really interesting test case, right? Because some of the theories sound really plausible when you look at alleviating addiction and depression and generalized anxiety and things like this, but they sound less plausible when you look at alleviating existential distress and fear of death and so on. And I think that goes for my theory too, right? My theory also sounds implausible when you look at the palliative context, but the very end is I'm going to try and say why it's not, why I think my theory actually maybe can work even in relation to the existential and palliative applications. So here's an idea that is seldom explicitly formulated or defended, but I think is often assumed. And it's basically what I've just been saying, right? The core mechanism of psychedelic therapy is the induction of comforting beliefs in what Alan Watts called a joyous cosmology, right? Some kind of non-naturalist, non-physicalist, metaphysical scheme according to which there is mind, intelligence, and purpose right at the foundations of reality, and ultimately somehow no matter how kind of troubling things might look on the level of everyday empirical reality, ultimately somehow all is well in the grand cosmic metaphysical scheme of things. And so this is a very natural thought to have, especially given the correlation, as I said, this fairly robust correlation between mystical type experiences and lasting benefits. And it's especially intuitive in the palliative case, where people are specifically losing fear of death and existential distress. But there are two things that I think create trouble for this theory. And the first one is, increasingly, some studies are starting to employ more measures than just these mystical experience questionnaires, and they're finding that some other constructs predict the lasting benefits as strongly or even more strongly than the mystical type experience construct. So you've got studies showing that, you know, yeah, whether you have a complete mystical type experience has a pretty good correlation with whether you get lasting benefits, but you have an even stronger correlation based on whether you have a psychological insight experience, right? An experience of insight into your own mind and life and problems that is very kind of down to earth and naturalistic. And then also there are these studies looking at things like emotional breakthrough, the EBI, the Emotional Breakthrough Inventory. And then qualitative research, right? I think qualitative interview studies with patients who have undergone this treatment also really create trouble for the metaphysical belief theory. So here's a patient who received LSD-assisted psychotherapy for anxiety and existential distress accompanying terminal illness. Well, this is not a patient, sorry, this is not a direct quote, but this is the researchers. I'm summarizing the findings of their qualitative study. The changes observed by our patients were mainly dependent on emotional experiences, but these do not match the criteria for mystical experiences. Ego boundaries were certainly loosened, but not completely absent. Through an altered basic emotional experience, loosening of ego functions combined with pronounced self-referential processing of significant intellectual or emotional content, patients may gain a new perspective on themselves and a reduction of ruminations and ego-centeredness. So essentially, you're going to have to take my word for it, but I think beyond this quotation, but I think the picture coming out of the qualitative interviews is not the sort you would expect if the core mechanism were the induction of comforting, non-physicalist, non-naturalist metaphysical beliefs. So there you go. I've refuted the metaphysical belief theory. I will not be taking further questions. Next up, right? So right at the opposite end of the conceptual spectrum is the idea that it's not actually the psychedelic experience doing much of the work at all. So there is this interesting evidence that psychedelics can boost processes of neuroplasticity at the cellular and molecular level, right? You take classic psychedelics, you apply them to cultured mammalian neurons, and you see that all the dendritic spines start growing and all these kind of cellular level neuroplastic processes are enhanced. And so presumably then, if they're doing that to cultured neurons, you have to assume that they're triggering that sort of low level process of neuroplasticity, whatever is going on at the experiential level, right? So you give the same dose of psychedelics to a bunch of different existentially distressed people. They're all going to have different experiences. But given that psychedelics are doing the neuroplasticity thing at the micro kind of cellular molecular level, you have to assume that some of that is going on in the brains of all of these existentially distressed people. So you kind of have the idea that maybe that's what is really doing the therapeutic work. Now, I don't have time to get into my cool philosophical distinction between three different interpretations of the neuroplasticity theory. I'll just keep it really simple and say, look, if the idea is that these low-level experience-independent or experience-invariant processes are contributing somewhat to the outcomes, that's fine, right? But if the claim is that those are the main driver of change and that the experience isn't really that important, why do you get all these correlations between the experiential variables and the lasting benefits, right? If some pure neuroplasticity theory is the correct account of psychedelic therapy, why don't you find that the dose of the drug or some other low-level biological variable is the strongest predictor of good outcomes? I think it's very hard to explain these consistent correlations between experiential factors and lasting benefits on a pure neuroplasticity theory, but it's very easy if you suppose that the experience itself is the main causal driver of change. So there we have what I consider to be two untenable opposed extremes. First of all, it's kind of metaphysical beliefs that are doing all the heavy lifting, and on the other end, it's not the experience at all. So my conclusion as time is running out is that the truth lies in the middle, right? It's the experience, it's something about the experience, but it's not this kind of metaphysical content about a joyous cosmology or whatever, because the qualitative evidence suggests that you don't actually get that all the time. You don't need that for good outcomes. So what is it? Well, Robin Carhart-Harris and Carl Friston say that psychedelics in a hierarchical predictive processing context, which you know all about by now, basically relax your most high-level beliefs, your most abstract fundamental beliefs about the self and world that sit at the top of this neural cognitive processing hierarchy. The main mechanism of psychedelics on a cognitive level is to decrease the brain's confidence in those beliefs. And so Carhart, Harris, and Friston think that a lot of the acute phenomenological effects of psychedelics and the therapeutic effects result from this basic process of kind of undermining or weakening or relaxing your most deep, fundamental, abstract, high-level beliefs about self and world. And so the idea is that in all these pathological conditions, you've got pathological beliefs, right? So maladaptive, high-level, often unconscious beliefs that are sort of supporting and maintaining the dysfunction, and psychedelics relax those beliefs, giving you an opportunity to revise them for the better. I think that's plausible, but I think it's not specific enough, right? So what kinds of beliefs exactly? According to me and Philip Gerrans, it's beliefs about the self, right? So we have this whole story about how psychedelic therapy is all about unbinding, in the technical jargon, these self-models in a predictive processing context. And so our story is that you have rigid maladaptive forms of self-representation or self-modeling across all these conditions for which psychedelics show promise. And it's by disrupting this process of self-representation or self-modeling and giving you a chance to revise that to develop new, healthier, more flexible self-models, new stories about who you are, that psychedelics cause these lasting psychological benefits. How am I going, Brian?
Well, you're out of time, but maybe another minute or two if you can somehow compress.
2? I'm very close.
Let's do 2.
Let's do 2. All right, thanks. So this, to me, sounds more plausible when you talk about depression, anxiety, and addiction in sort of non-palliative context than when you talk about existential anxiety and fear of death, right? How on earth could kind of loosening your narratives, your autobiographical stories about who you are and giving you a chance to revise them, reconcile you to your own kind of imminent demise and to the apparent futility and meaninglessness of it all? Well, here again, and this is a direct quotation from someone in that LSD study for terminal cancer patients. And this person says, talking about their experience, it was less about my illness. I was able to put it into perspective, not to see oneself with one's sickness as center. There are more important things in life, the evolution of humankind, for example. Your inner ego gets diminished, I believe, and you are looking at the whole. You are indeed starting to build relations with plants or with the entire living world around. You think less about yourself. You are thinking across borders. So this suggests a model that sounds almost insultingly simplistic, but it might be part of the truth, that part of what's happening in these conditions of kind of profound existential angst is there is just a rigid, invariant focus on the self and its existential predicament, right? The threatened, vulnerable self. And that in cases like this, in which psychedelics undermine these processes of self-representation that ordinarily have such an important role in governing the allocation of attention, salience, right? So what we pay attention to is a function largely of what we care about, what we think matters, which, skimming over a whole bunch of theoretical assumptions here, is a function of the model we have of ourselves and the kind of person we are and the particular things that matter to us, the problems we have, and so on. If you can disrupt that system and break the cycle, then you allow space for other attentional cycles to arise, right? So instead of having this feedback loop between sort of attention to the horrifying existential predicament, negative emotional reactions leading to more and more attention to the horrifying existential predicament, you can, to put it really kind of tritely, see that the glass is half full, right? You can have all these other attentional cycles develop once you break that one that focus on, well, look, you know, isn't it a miracle that I'm here at all? And isn't every day a gift? Isn't every breath a gift? And all these hallmark type things are the things that people who have psychedelics tend to end up saying with a lot of fervor in their voices and often with tears in their eyes. And they say that, you know, these kinds of things that sound trite and banal are the things that you really come to appreciate and feel deeply as a consequence of these experiences. So conclusion, there might still be hope for applying psychedelics to the neuroexistentialist project, especially if my theory is true. It might be, but more research is required. Thanks and sorry for going on.